experience. But during this experience, I was taken into a complete altered dimension where everything is waves, including the level of the body, which is really important because that is how I've ended up healing myself. And the level of the emotions, the most important and most overlooked level of ourselves. I mean, hi, my name's Katie Darling. So my story really does go back to my birth because I was born in, I'm 73 years old, and I was born in England to two British physicists who had been drafted to help create the bomb during World War II. And so they were members of the English version of the Manhattan Project. It was the same project. And so by the time I was born in 1951, the bomb had been dropped on hundreds of thousands of innocent people in Hiroshima. And my parents were aghast at the horror that they had helped unleash, intending to stop Hitler. So I was born into this very unusual environment where, my friends from my primary school, my elementary school, had blue sky, white cloud wallpaper in their bedrooms. And all around my house, there were pictures of mushroom clouds because the anti-nuclear movement pretty much started in our living room. And so I was born into this atmosphere that basically told me that I was responsible for saving the world, which I'm still trying, but sorry, I haven't succeeded yet. And I was also about to experience nuclear meltdown by tea time today. That was the kind of atmosphere in our house. And so that was a feeling of apocalyptic intensity that literally got into my cells. And a lot of people are experiencing that now. It's 2024. And so I have some insights to share about what I have realized through a very unusual, looking back, it's a rather unusual life. So I grew up in that atmosphere, and around puberty, my nuclear family melted down, haha. And, divorce, and not just divorce, but a crazy mother and sister, a diagnosably crazy, bless their souls, mother and sister, I was left with. And I grew up, I decided to become a therapist. I got into university, and I couldn't believe how terrible the university was. Even though it was a very progressive university, they were just not really resolving any of the issues that were really going on for me or anyone else. So I started walking barefoot around Europe. I took a sabbatical for a term from school, and I started walking around Europe, and I really can't remember why. I was not taking drugs. Everyone around me was tripping, but I was not taking drugs. But I was feeling this feeling that I was being called towards something, a little bit like in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, where the guy starts making a little shape of a mountain in his mashed potatoes, and he is being called towards a meeting with these seemingly higher light beings, these ETs. So something like that was happening for me, but it wasn't ETs. Did I mention that my parents were atheists? They were major atheists. They were atheists where my father was the guy that the Times newspaper would call on for an atheist opinion. And so I was an atheist, and I felt very profoundly intelligent being a materialist atheist. And yet I was getting this strange calling, and I wandered around Europe, landed in Holland, and had a bad experience with a boy, which has been or was a lifelong pattern. It's now resolved. And I was walking away from this farm that I had been staying on. And as I was walking down this street towards the train station, I felt this terrible, ghastly despair. Have you ever felt that? It wasn't even a panic attack. It was way beyond any fear that I could even have imagined. I mean, meltdown, a nuclear holocaust would be nothing compared to this experience I was having. And so somebody had given me a little leaflet about breathing. We did not yet have yoga and breathing and all that in England. At least I was unaware of them. And so I just tried tuning into my breath. And all of a sudden, I basically disappeared. And some presence came over me that was pure, infinite, intelligent love. And I'm only able to talk about this as so many people who've had spiritually transformative experiences, they say that I can't really put words on it. And I certainly couldn't put words on mine. I had absolutely no context, as people say. I didn't even have the context of God because I didn't believe in God. And so I just found myself, it was like a walk-in experience. I was kind of replaced by this blissful, loving presence. But it wasn't just a complete, I am the presence. It was a relational presence. And it was a who, not a what. So I could probably have been convinced of some version of God or the divine or source that would have involved quantum fields and 0 point, fields, because that was the subject of conversation at dinner in our household. But God, that would be a loving presence when I didn't even have, my parents were very involved with banning the bomb. I did not have secure attachment, happy childhood, even emotionally. So I had no really knowing of this level of love. Well, none of us do, really. We still don't. And I just was carried by this love. And in retrospect, as I say, I think it was like a kind of walk-in, but it wasn't a full walk-in. But at my talk at IANDS, I showed a slide of my face before and my face after this experience, and it's pretty unrecognizable. So I did the only thing that I could find to do. I was completely disoriented at this point as far as the world is concerned, because I realized, oh, this must be God. And I remember having a fleeting thought went through that said, this is not going to go well with my parents. And it didn't. So I did the only thing I could do, which was I joined the first guru cult that I came upon, because I couldn't go back into the world of what I would now call anger and duality and attack. And I remember, to confirm that I seemed like a walk-in, my old friends found me boring, and my wicked ha-ha stepmother said, you just became too good. We just couldn't stand you because you were too good. And I definitely was not trying to signal virtue. I just kind of had become just merged in this love, and it didn't last. But it lasted for quite a long time with the added experience of being in this spiritual group. It was a cult, but it was also a very profound spiritual group practicing Kriyas. And I got the ability to kind of merge myself into God in the sort of going up way, coming up into the center of the head and seeing light, and going back into what might be called stillness. And I stayed in that spiritual group. My teacher sent me around the world, and I ended up traveling through Spain and South America as a meditation teacher. And as time went on, something else was happening inside me, which was I was getting more and more split within myself, because I was splitting, because I was going up without going down, which only ever always doesn't work, right? So I was ascending without descending. And as Jung says, if you don't integrate your shadow, it will become your destiny. And my shadow was all of the above, which I've already mentioned, and probably thousands of lifetimes that I brought in. But my shadow was that I felt all kinds of feelings that I had been spiritually bypassing quite successfully for a few years. But after 12 years, I crashed down into my body and my emotions. And I made my way out of the cult, and I actually became a therapist, which I had not finished my degree to become a therapist, but I gave myself the degree of MSU, which is making stuff up, because through very miraculous circumstance, I found out that that was what I was here on earth to do. Now, when I say therapist, I don't mean a licensed psychotherapist. Um, Therapy means the work of God. Theo is God, and rapere is to do. And it's like doing the work of God. And that's what I realized I was supposed to do, although a lot of it was a lot like therapy. And I learned breathwork, and I started doing hypnotherapy, and all these things came through me to do with people, and people showed up to have sessions from me. And this went on and went on. I started teaching seminars, and I became what I said on my business card, a multidimensional consultant. And I worked with people on the level of emotions and breath and body, as well as the level of ascending into the pure oneness of the I am consciousness, which back then was unusual. People were doing one or the other. They still are, actually, mostly. And I kept going. And when I was about four, so that happened when I was 30, that crash. And I kept going until I was about 45, and which was in 1995. And I started running out of steam for this work. And I ran out of steam so much because when I emerged from this spiritual bypass, I found myself with chronic illness that nobody could resolve, nothing and nobody. And I now know what it all is. But for decades of my life, I was pursuing doctors and alternate therapies and everything to try to resolve it, not knowing what it really was. And that's another story. So in 1995, I was in bed, sick and broke and completely scared for about 9 months, which is a very potent gestation period. And I had my second really unusual awakening. So, people talk about awakenings, and certainly when I was a monk, I used to go into what is called samadhi probably once a week for years and years and years. So it's not all it's cracked up to be, guys and gals. It's always there, and it's a really important ability to be able to go home into oneness. But we also have to come back into the complex natural world that we have incarnated into in order that those parts of ourselves can get remarried instead of being separate. Our emotions and our body are like the feminine, and the I am, the pure spiritual consciousness, is obviously the masculine. So I was in bed for 9 months. I was trying everything, surrendering, breathing, affirmations, all the things I was practicing, and nothing. And I just I can't even say, I can't reverse engineer how this mutation happened, but it was like a mutation where all of a sudden I was transported into another dimension one day in bed, and I was shown telepathically, but also through the sense of energetic waves going through my being, that everything in the whole universe is made of waves. It's not made of waves, it is waves. It's not that the things are made of waves, it's that waves make the things. So waves, these fractal waves of life force that are very complex, move through the universe and then in sort of freeze in an interference pattern with other waves, and then we get what seems to be matter. But I didn't know that before this experience. But during this experience, I was taken into a complete altered dimension where everything is waves, including the level of the body, which is really important because that is how I've ended up healing myself, and how here I am at 73. Okay. And the level of the emotions, the most important and most overlooked level of ourselves. I mean, when New Age evolved in the bookstores to mind, body, spirit, who took out the emotions? Whatever happened to my emotions? This is the real taboo area, the emotional area, because we try to control it with our mind, or we try to appease it with our body in some way through some chemistry. But in fact, the emotions have their own doorway where they can get completely transmuted back into love and power. So anyway, I realized all this. For 3 days, I was taken, and it's completely difficult to explain, because this being, this presence, this field of waviness told me that it was to be called the mother wave. And it wasn't a person, although I did become very fond of the goddess and images of God and goddess. I became much more devotional actually after this. But it started downloading through me. And literally within about 2 weeks, I jumped out of bed and I started teaching, and my living room filled up with people. No advertising, just an amazing phenomenon of, I had such an awakening that people, I guess, told each other. And I started teaching in my living room. There were 30 people in 2 weeks. And I had been trying to get clients. I was in one of those low dips, which started this whole process of gestation followed by birth into wave world. And so I started downloading, and that was 1995, which I guess is about 29 years ago. And I have been downloading ever since. And it's actually not been a complete blessing to me personally. It's been quite intense. So it developed into a seminar that was about 60 hours long, with me downloading, but not just me talking, but teaching people these practices that would help them access these wavy levels of body, emotions, mind, and of course, spirit. And it became a mystery school, and about 5,000 people went through it. And it went on for about 20 years. And there were 7 levels. Each level was 60 hours. So if you're listening in 2024, you probably can't imagine sitting still for even the short talk that I'm giving, because we've lost our attention, which is actually the only apocalypse that we're going through. So I taught it, and I taught, and I taught, and it was incredibly blissful. And these layers downloaded through me. And I had this big house and big school, and a good-looking husband that seemed to be my soulmate, and all this enthusiasm and love coming towards me. And in about 2004, I was feeling like I had created most of this through metaphysics, sometimes known nowadays as law of attraction, right? So I had basically known that this was where I was going, and then it sort of came, that things would expand and succeed, and I'd be with the right person. And so this was a metaphysically manifested reality that I was very successful. And then I realized that I was kind of exhausted from how much creating I was doing, even if it was mental and also hard work. And so I just started a little process, a little mystical process of practicing surrender. And it was like a 40-day surrender affirmations. And by the 10th day, my entire inflated by deliberate mind bubble collapsed. And my husband was having an affair with my secretary, I found out. And that's just the beginning of an absolutely unbelievable dark night of the soul that I went into, where every aspect of my life collapsed. My friends, my school, my marriage, my financial situation, my legal situation, my own home I couldn't live in, my own school I couldn't teach in, and much more, much more than that. I eventually got a serious illness that most people are most afraid of. And So this third major awakening in my life caused me to have to evolve from a pretty good understanding of the emotional and energetic body part of the self and how thoughts create reality. And I had to go mystical. So my husband Greg and I call ourselves New Wave Mystics because we are now, like, well, he became in his own path, and I became, instead of just a metaphysician or a spiritual person or anything like that, I had to become a mystic. And it's not a branding, it's not an identity. That's exactly what it's not. I was basically, life did me in through a series of circumstances where every deep sense of abandonment and disaster and fear and apocalypse and my very sensitive nervous system and body were completely assaulted by attacks. I had nowhere to go. And so then I went into the real surrender, which I had come to believe I didn't have to go through because I had sort of hacked consciousness, and I had decided I'm not going to go through the suffering doorway. I'm going to create a doorway where we can go through joyfully and willingly. But that wasn't apparently what I signed up for in my pre-life plan. And I'm not saying that anyone else has to go through this. But I really did go through a dark night of the soul that went on for years and years and years, and can't even tell it. And part of the reason I don't want to tell very much of it is a bit similar to the way I don't like watching NDEs, where the first half of it is medical details of disaster, because it's just a meme that, I virally catch. I don't know if you do, but I do. So I don't like to tell all the stuff that happened in my life in too much detail, because how will that benefit you? The only way that I want to be here is if I can be of benefit. But what I can say enough is that I was able to get through it into an extraordinary life with my real partner, uh, Greg, that I married in 2020, who was my co-speaker at IANDS recently. I was able to go through it all by handing over my life really to the understanding of oneness, not just to say, oh, it's all one. I remember that my roommates in college who used to do LSD all around me, they would used to say, it's all one, man. Hey, don't worry about it. It's all one, man. And it's kind of like, well, not quite that oneness. Oneness is another word. The one is another word for God or goddess or source or whatever we call it. Oneness is one of the words for it. So whether you call it, as you've heard this sentence 1,000 times, you may call it Brahma, you may call it Allah, you may call it Jesus. Yeah, that list of things. But then really, whatever it is, there's only one of it. And the realization of oneness was what I was pushed into. Because two-ness, this dualistic world of people who love you and then they don't, and situations that work for you, and you inflate them with intention and sort of like become a control freak to try and make it all work, and then it collapses. That's the dualistic world. But what I discovered slowly and painfully through plunging into a study of new mysticism. So new mysticism compared to old mysticism is a good example is Course in Miracles. I'm sure you all know what Course in Miracles is. This is Course in Miracles, a very fat book. And I went back to studying that. And then I discovered a little known mystic who Eckhart Tolle and Wayne Dyer and Marianne Williamson all say was major mystic of the 20th century. Joel Goldsmith. You won't be able to remember his name because it's kind of, people think, oh, it's Joseph Goldstein. See, I said that. So I started going into this work called The Infinite Way, which doesn't really matter. It's not a group or anything like that. just as Course in Miracles isn't a group, it's a higher teaching that has come through from beyond the veil. And so is the Infinite Way. And I started to practice this practical mysticism where everything in my life, and I mean the real things that are very important from the special effects of being human, which are love, wealth, meaning supply, health, and life purpose. And community might be another too. So I started not being able to I started not being able to get those things to work. I mean, those things had all blown up on me. And so I started trusting this new mysticism that says that that is how heaven or God or the new earth or the dimension of spirit already is, that everything is supplied, that God or whatever you call it, the community of soul or oneness, knows already what we need and want. In fact, if it's in time at all, it's in our future. It's an attractor. In chaos theory, they call it a strange attractor. That divinity is, in terms of our experience of time, is in our future, pulling us like a tractor beam towards our highest possible potential or future. And when you start to live in a knowing of that, fear starts to release. We're all so bound up in fear, and it still is going through. There's so many fear memes right now, the whole apocalypse consciousness that is actually clickbait for people's websites that are purporting to be spiritual. That's crazy. So let's cancel the apocalypse while we're at it, and let's get everything done in this talk. And so I started living my life as though oneness were true, and as though a benevolent, loving creator is not over there on the other side of some veil, but actually right here. And it's kind of like an alternate dimension. And this is 5D, as people have called it, or some people call it 4D. Actually, Joel Goldsmith called it 4D way back in the 40s and 50s. So it's kind of like 5D consciousness is coexisting with the two-ness, the duality. And yet there are ways that you can go back into this oneness, this dimension that contains everything and that is pure love, and have it actually guide your life. And I really mean completely practically. And so I started living my life according to mystical principles. And one of the main mystical principles is that God is good, and God even comes from an old Danish word that means good. So God is good. It's not good and bad. In oneness, there's no good and bad. It's only ever good. And it's very hard to get used to because we're so used to being intelligent enough to see everything has an opposite. And it's very hard for the mind to comprehend and have a realization of oneness because it's designed for two-ness. But through Course in Miracles, they call it mind training. And through studying mystical principles, I was able to get my mind, some part of my mind, over into the understanding and realization of oneness. And as I did, things started to unfold slowly, like a sea liner that is making a long grumbling turn. But my life started to turn around, where I had pretty much a miraculous healing from the above mentioned unnamed health issue. My finances, which had been absolutely cut off at the, top of what seemed to be the source, I realized that the source of finance and source of supply is in a different dimension. So I stopped trying to get it from the outside, although I didn't stop being practical, but I was too ill and too wiped out emotionally to do very much. And I just started knowing that God is the source of my supply, but really knowing it, it started to work. And I teach that as a sort of sideline. And then my life purpose was happening. I rebooted my school and it's calling it Soulwave, and it's now called iWave. I'm actually in my office, and that's the iWave explanation. And things went on, and then more and more things happened. This is such a weird story that it would be a big autobiography, just this third part of my life since I was 52. And so things went on, and all my family started dying in England. And I again went into sort of things were getting better. And then I went through another sort of darker night in a way, because I was getting older and I didn't have a partner. And I wasn't trying to make a partner happen because I had really given everything over to Source and trusting in Source. And so I was working, and I did start to have a very busy private practice, which I still do, of coaching people into this realization and PTSD healing and a whole bunch of stuff that I do. But I was lonely, and then lockdown started, and I was really lonely because I had no family. And my best friend of 40 years had died. He was a man called Lawrence who had had 3 NDEs and actually was in the NDE magazine from IANDS. And I was just incredibly lonely on my own in my home. And most of my friends were really happy because their family had moved home. But I was kind of stuck here. And so I really went very deeply into my trust in the love of the divine to do everything for me. And so I went to a webinar based on Joel Goldsmith's work. And on all the little Zoom pictures, there was this one old black guy. He looked about 85 because he had a big white mustache. And he said something in the webinar that completely felt like a divine revelation, but I can't remember what it was. And we've actually gone back and tried to find the recording, but it's not there. But he gave a little transmission, and I just absolutely was almost shocked because it was like God was speaking to me directly. So I private chatted him and I said, let's be friends. And I really thought he was 85, and he really thought I was in my 90s because I was telling him about a teacher I have that's 105, who is a teacher from Joel Goldsmith's work. And so he thought I must be in my 80s or 90s. And so we both thought that we were just having a spiritual friendship with an older person. And anyway, we're married now. After a month of connecting on Zoom, we realized that this was actually what had been always planned for us to be together. This was the most amazing miracle of soulmatedness. And I knew about soulmates for decades. I manifested too, through manifestation, but this was the mystical method. So that's my story, and here I am. My website is called iWave, iwave.com. And there's a YouTube channel called iWave Katie. I do private coaching, and I'm also starting again. I just started last week to do seminars and webinars. So if you go to iWave, IWAVE .love. .love. So love is like the com. iWave.love. That's our website. And we'll welcome communing with anyone whom we can help. That's really our mission in life, is a love transmission. So